For centuries, a long linen cloth has been stirring passions. Some believe that it is the real shroud that was used to bury Christ, while others believe that it is nothing more than a fraud dating back to the Middle Ages, a hoax created in the name of faith. Here I am on the path taken by this relic over the centuries. This path will take me from Jerusalem to the city gates of Paris, where I will meet with experts who have been debating its authenticity for decades.
Everyone knows that the shroud has had a very eventful history.
We need to remember that in ancient times, all burial clothing was held in contempt. The Holy Shroud was preserved in a silver reliquary, which was kept in a hole in the wall that still exists today, behind this altar, which dates back to the 18th century.
The image that we see on the shroud has the characteristics of a photographic negative.
The Byzantines were great collectors of Christ relics.
Bishop Pierre d'Arcy denounced the shroud as a hoax, a fake relic. The shroud was taken to Constantinople.
Carbon dating results had a bombshell effect. The shroud was dated between 1250 and 1360 by 3 laboratories.
That carbon dating was mistaken.
Although the Catholic Church feels that the tenets of faith found in the Holy Bible are enough to guide religious followers, over the centuries, many Christians have been driven to find objects attesting to the validity of the events described in the Bible. In the Middle Ages, these relics became objects of veneration.
Worshipping of relics was a pretty widespread practice in the Middle Ages. It was of considerable importance, but I think it resulted from a fairly relatively slow evolution. Then, around the second half of the 4th century, there was an outbreak of miracles observed on or near the burial sites of holy martyrs. They became the first saints.
I'm in Turin now, the capital of Piedmont. Turin is the 4th largest city in Italy, after Rome, Milan, and Naples. It is said that Turin was once considered to be one of the most occult cities in Europe. It is likely that the city got this reputation from the monument in Piazza Statuto, dominated by a black angel with a reversed pentacle on its head. For occultists, this is a symbol for Lucifer, the fallen angel. There are also 2 statues at the Gran Madre di Dio church, one of which is a Madonna holding the Holy Grail, the famous cup used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. But what brings me to Turin is the Cathedral of San Giovanni Battista. Since the mid-16th century, this church has been in possession of the most famous Christian artifact of all, the Holy Shroud.
In French, it's usually referred to as the Shroud de Turin, but personally, I don't agree with that name because a suaire is a cloth used to wipe off sweat. The name comes from Sudario de Oviedo. Sudario is the Italian word for sudarium. The sheet in Turin is a shroud, a burial cloth, which the French refer to as linceul. It's a piece of linen, of course, and the word linceul comes from the Latin linteum. It's approximately 1 meter by 3 meters. It can be stretched somewhat, but there's something special about its measurements. It is 2 cubits wide, according to Jewish tradition at the time of Christ, and 8 cubits long. This linen cloth has bloodstains on it, and these bloodstains form 2 images of a dead man who was crucified, who went through an ordeal that corresponds to what we know about the Passion of Christ. The 2 images join at the head, which shows that there was some sort of... that the image was reproduced. A phenomenon of some kind reproduced the image, and it has been recognized as the Shroud of Jesus Christ since its existence, and the images were confirmed in the Gospel.
Does this burial cloth correspond to descriptions in Holy Scripture and to archaeological discoveries made in Palestine? The description given in the Gospels for the laying of Jesus' body in the tomb and the discovery of the empty tomb and the burial clothing on the 3rd day is rather vague. To find some answers to my questions, I went to Jerusalem to meet with Father Eamon Kelly.
Welcome everybody to our presentation. Who is the man of the shroud?
Father Kelly works at the Notre Dame of Jerusalem Pontifical Institute.
It would be interesting to have had more written evidence. We don't have it, but we do have the shroud, and the shroud has a lot of questions and a lot of intriguing issues that are not resolved by science and by our knowledge. There is a clear mentioning of the linen cloths in the Gospels, in which he was wrapped in Matthew's Gospel. It says in a clean linen cloth or shroud, depending on the translation. There's also mention in John's Gospel.
One of the first indications of the shroud's existence seems to date back to the beginning of the 4th century. Some authors spoke of a shroud, while others spoke of a veil. Some claimed that there was an image on it at the time. Others made no mention at all of an image. John is somewhat more detailed in his account. It is believed that he was an eyewitness to the events. He wrote that the shroud was one piece of the burial clothing, but that there were others. So in one version of this gospel, the word othonia is used, which some have translated as strips of linen. But since John added, following Jewish burial custom, they wrapped Jesus' body, I don't think they were talking about strips of linen. It was much more likely to be a large linen cloth.
Matthew and Mark wrote that Joseph of Arimathea bought a linen cloth, in which he wrapped Jesus' body before laying it in the tomb. It should be mentioned that the use of strips or bandages is subject to interpretation. John originally used the Greek word othonia to describe what Jesus was wrapped in, and this word has generally been translated as strips. Linguists and exegetes do, however, agree that the word othonia might have a broader meaning, such as clothing, veil, tunic, or strip. It might have been used to describe something that was not thin strips like bandages, but rather something like a lightweight linen sheet. If we look at these descriptions, then the fabric being preserved in Turin might be the shroud described in the canonical texts. The man depicted on the shroud is lying straight, hands folded over his groin, arms slightly out at the sides. There are many wounds and lacerations on the body. Wounds at the wrists, on the feet, and on the side of the body, and lesions around the head.
Much more just a personal reflection before the image. And maybe to
the man on the shroud seems to have been buried according to Jewish custom. We know today that the Essenians, a Jewish community from Qumran, buried their dead in the exact same way. Traditionally, at the time, Jewish custom required the body to be washed and the hands and the feet bound with strips of fabric. A mortuary veil called a sudarium was then placed on the face of the deceased. The body was then wrapped in a linen cloth, often prepared with spices, and laid in the tomb. Clearly, the body of the man on the shroud was not treated this way, but we must bear in mind that Jesus died the day before Sabbath, and his body was taken quickly to the tomb.
Is near the place he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb. Okay. So we also have to realize that it's Friday afternoon. Mm-hmm. That's the beginning of Shabbat. It's also the time of the Passover. Yeah. So there's very little time to accomplish the burial of our Lord, and they need to do a hasty job. And even the Gospels testify to that by saying that they didn't complete the proper rituals of burial, and they would return again after the Shabbat to finalize the burial.
And that is why the women, including Mary Magdalene, returned to the tomb on the third day, just to complete the burial rituals. So why wasn't the shroud mentioned in the Gospels? And is the Shroud of Turin really the Shroud of Christ? By what extraordinary turn of events did the shroud get moved from a rock tomb in Jerusalem to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin? I wanted to find out, so I followed the path taken by the shroud.
The shroud was taken to Constantinople. It stayed there until 1204, according to some texts.
Constantinople was attacked by Latin Christians serving the Pope on their crusade, and it was put to the sword, put to the torch. One of the witnesses at the time said that when the Latin Crusaders stormed into Constantinople, they murdered the priests, they abused the nuns, and they stole anything of value.
It appears to have been stolen by a crusader named Autant de la Roche. It surfaced a year later, in 1205, in the possession of Autant de la Roche, Duke of Athens. There is a hole in the shroud's history from 1205 to 1357. No one really knows what happened to it, but somehow it ended up in the possession of the Charny family.
It is not known how the relic made its way into the hands of the Charny family. Some say that Geoffroy de Charny, a brave knight, acquired it during one of his campaigns. Other sources say that it was a gift or a legacy of some sort. Whatever the case may be, the shroud was publicly displayed for the first time in 1357 at the church in Lirey, France. The presence of this extraordinary relic attracted pilgrims from the entire region. Over the years, Lirey became a pilgrimage site. Unfortunately, not everyone was enthralled with the shroud, including Pierre d'Arcy, Bishop of Troyes, who didn't really appreciate the fact that his followers were leaving Troyes and heading to Lirey.
Pierre d'Arcy was the region's bishop. He denounced the shroud as a hoax, a fake relic devised to take advantage of Christians. And this letter to the Avignon Pope claimed to be based on a diligent inquiry. Pierre d'Arcy wasn't content with simply stating, "This is a fake relic." He went on to say, "Here's why." Pierre d'Arcy's famous letter to the Pope was based on alleged evidence from his predecessor, Henri de Poitiers. According to the letter, Henri de Poitiers had, what shall we call it? He had proof, after speaking with an artist, that the artist had painted the image on the shroud himself, the shroud now on display in Turin.
So Pierre d'Arcy beseeched upon the Pope Clement VII to intervene. Clement VII had an inquiry launched through the usual channels of the time. Pierre d'Arcy was asked to produce the artist, since he claimed to have met him. Well, naturally, Pierre d'Arcy couldn't provide any concrete proof to back up his story. And a year later, in 1390, Bishop d'Arcy was told to stop talking about it, or he would be excommunicated. So the sanction was pretty serious. And then Clement VII reinstated veneration of the relic, with a certain amount of reserve. So he passed this message on to Christians, with the usual reserve demonstrated to the public with regard for relics or apparitions which have not been authenticated. Anyways, that's how it was at the time. There was always a certain reserve expressed by the clergy, since the clergy were generally hesitant about mystic events, mystic visions, and relics, since the Christian faith is contained in the Gospels. So the church was always reserved, even about specific things.
As far as skeptics are concerned, the Shroud of Turin with the image of Christ on it is a fake, since there are no references to the shroud before the Middle Ages. However, in Edessa, Turkey, a cloth bearing the image of Christ, nicknamed the Holy Mandylion, was known about long before the appearance of the Shroud of Turin.
The Holy Mandylion appeared for certain during the 6th century, and it was discovered after the town of Edessa was flooded. It was hidden. Relics were always being hidden in walls. So there it was, hidden behind some stones, and after a flood, repairs were ordered by the Byzantine emperor, and the relic was discovered. After the flood, it was immediately recognized as a kerapoetis, which means a divinely wrought image. Only a face can be seen on the cloth.
According to some historians, people who specialize in the history of the shroud, what is referred to as the Holy Mandylion from the town of Edessa is actually the same cloth as the Shroud of Turin.
But how can two pieces of cloth of such different sizes possibly be the same relic? So now I am on my way to Istanbul, Turkey, formerly known as Constantinople, where the Holy Mandylion was preserved at the time. Istanbul is the only city in the world that sits on two continents, Europe and Asia. Back then, the city of Istanbul was built on the vestiges of the Greek colony of Byzantium by Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who wanted to make it the new Rome. He was the one who renamed it Constantinople. Strolling down the streets of Istanbul, you can see the many influences left by its past: Greek, Roman, and Arab.
In 944, the Byzantines launched an attack against Edessa, which lasted several months in hopes of finding this relic. The Byzantines were great collectors of Christ relics, so they launched an attack, and since the Muslims in Edessa refused to surrender, they made an offer to the Caliph to release 200 prisoners that the Byzantines had captured. They gave him 30,000 silver pieces in exchange for the relic. Back then, Christians were respected in Edessa. The relic arrived in Constantinople by boat on August 14th, 944.
The Edessa cloth was placed in the Pharos chapel of the imperial palace of Bukolion, which has long since disappeared. Many historical chronicles speak of this extraordinary image, which they refer to as the Holy Mandylion, mentioning that it can be found in Constantinople. The relic has been described as a small cloth, more or less square in shape. Mandylion comes from the Arabic word mandil, which means scarf or napkin. The face of Christ appears on the cloth.
The mandylion was a cloth that was folded such that only a face could be seen. So obviously, we could say that historians were making a rough estimate of its size. But to say that it went from being the Holy Mandylion in Edessa to the shroud in Constantinople, which suddenly began to be used, is still quite surprising. And we need to remember that in ancient times, all burial clothing was held in contempt. So being presented with Jesus' burial clothing would have been pretty shocking for Christians. And that's why it was folded for the first few centuries after his death.
In 1204, as the Fourth Crusade got into full swing, Venetian leaders found themselves pitted against the forces of Western Christianity, resulting in a schism that led to major civil conflict.
History books say that Constantinople was captured and sacked in 1204, but in reality, it went on for several years afterwards. Latin leaders, the Western Christians, took over the city. It was a fairly complicated story. On one hand, there was a crusade that got diverted, the Fourth Crusade. And on the other hand, there were also power struggles going on within Constantinople itself between two rivals, two Greek Byzantine emperors who got the Crusaders involved in their political intrigue. And that's how the Latins ended up entering the city. And once inside, they stole the city's treasures. Naturally, they stole religious artifacts, but they also stole other treasures from the city as well.
In the ensuing chaos, churches and fortified buildings were pillaged, and numerous treasures and religious artifacts disappeared. One of them was the holy mandylion. A century and a half later, a sacred cloth bearing the face of Christ appeared in Lire, France. It was in the possession of a renowned knight, Geoffroy de Charny, Lord of Lire. I'm now on the road to Chambéry, France, since it appears that in 1453, the Holy Shroud passed into the hands of the Savoy family, rulers of Piedmont. Chambéry was the House of Savoy's residence at the time. I met with Philippe Raffaelli, curator of the Savoy estate.
So it was originally a stately chapel, built to replace an older chapel that had been constructed under the orders of Amédée VIII, Count of Savoy. It was a precise order. Construction began in 1408 and continued until 1430. At first, it was a private, stately chapel. The Holy Shroud arrived much later. Throughout the late 15th century, there was a progressive movement as the relic became venerated by the public. And I would say that this is when the great period of the Holy Shroud of Chambéry began. It lasted several years, into the first half of the 16th century. So that was when people began making pilgrimages to see the shroud. And in 1506, the Pope authorized public veneration of the shroud, which generated a lot of religious devotion and activities. Pilgrimages to the site of the relic, here in Chambéry. There were public displays of the shroud, and they didn't always take place inside the chapel, because the shroud was conserved in a shrine, in a reliquary. Now and then, it would be taken out and presented to the crowd of onlookers.
Around that time, Pope Sixtus IV declared the shroud to be authentic and officially approved it as a public cult. Then, on the night of December 3rd, 1532, the shroud came within a hair of disappearing forever.
You have to imagine what it was like. The decor you see today is quite bare. The church looks nothing like it did before the huge fire of 1532. The Holy Shroud was preserved in a silver reliquary, which was kept in a hole in the wall that still exists today, behind this altar, which dates back to the 18th century. So it's much more recent than the whole question of the shroud. It was a hole in the wall behind the choir with a special spot for the reliquary. The fire was an accident, but it soon took on enormous proportions because it wasn't just the chapel that caught on fire. Other buildings burnt as well. The Holy Shroud was barely saved. It was repaired, and I use that term loosely, by the Poor Clare nuns after the fire.
In 1578, Turin became the new capital of Savoy, and Duke Emmanuel Philibert ordered the cloth to be transferred to the Turin Cathedral. In 1983, 4 centuries later, upon the death of Italy's King Umberto II of the Savoy family, the artifact was finally turned over to the Pope. The shroud now officially belonged to the Church. Nowadays, the Holy Shroud is still preserved in Turin. A short distance from the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist lies the Holy Shroud Museum in Turin. Here, the most important exhibit dedicated to the shroud allows visitors to discover more than simply all of the objects associated with the shroud. They also have a chance to become familiar with its history and the numerous scientific studies that have been carried out on it. Although the shroud's history prior to the 14th century remains ambiguous, it has been well documented since the shroud appeared in Lire. Up until the 19th century, no real scientific research had ever been done on the shroud. Then in 1898, one incident in particular boosted the shroud to the ranks of a miraculous artifact.
It had been known for quite some time, since at least 1357, that the shroud bore an image. But the image was a photographic negative, as we discussed earlier. The fact that it was a negative caused a lot of confusion. There was even speculation for a while that Jesus of Nazareth must have been black. Because you could see the negative image of him on the shroud, no one had ever seen a positive image of him. So, in 1898, Italian lawyer and amateur photographer Secondo Pia had the idea of asking permission to capture the Shroud of Turin on photographic plates.
When the photographers printed the negative of the image, he saw it in a positive way. He understood, in fact, the negative image is more visible, more clear than the normal image on the shroud. He understood that the shroud is a negative, and so seeing the photographic negative, we see the positive of the image. And this was a very important date because it started in this moment the modern scientific history of the shroud.
Naturally, the discovery that the image on the Shroud of Turin was a photographic negative had a bombshell effect on everyone, including religious followers, agnostics, and those opposed to the Catholic Church. They couldn't say that it was a fake. They couldn't invent something that had yet to be invented by specialists. So right away, there were claims that Secondo Pia had somehow tampered with the photos, that he had tricked them. It wasn't until 1902 when Henry, the official photographer of Turin, took another photograph of the shroud that it was confirmed that Secondo Pia had not tricked his photos.
With the photographs taken by Secondo Pia and Giuseppe Enrie, the Shroud of Turin became the object of unexpected scientific interest. Researchers began to document facts about the shroud and its history. Between 1930 and 1950, French surgeon Peter Barbet performed detailed studies on the image of the tortured man. In his opinion, it was clear that the man portrayed on the shroud bore the marks of crucifixion.
He was crucified in a particular way, which made it possible to identify his crucifixion. People who were crucified were usually tied to the cross using rope, and they died of thirst. Jesus was nailed to the cross. That in itself was horrible, because nailing someone's hand in destot space would hit the median nerve. That was despicable. Whenever you hit a major nerve, you produce an incredible amount of pain. And both of his hands were nailed, both of his feet were also nailed. They were placed in a position where they were totally locked, so that any movement at all was impossible.
All of those studies were repeated by Americans in even more detail, using modern techniques which showed that the stains that were believed to be blood were indeed blood, human blood. There were also studies done on dust and pollens, which proved that the shroud must have originated in the Middle East. Researchers were also able to establish the exact composition of the image. Of course, this didn't happen until a public showing of the shroud in 1978, when, for the first time ever, scientists were given permission to examine the shroud up close for a week. There was a team of American researchers known as STURP, which stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. They performed the most thorough analysis, examining the image from every angle possible. Contrary to what was popularly believed for the longest time, and what some media continue to claim even now, The image is not a painting.
Il ne s'agit absolument pas d'une peinture.
The American STURP team showed that the image was due to superficial oxidation of the linen's fibers, where the warp threads and the weft threads
À
interlaced.
l'endroit où les fils de chaîne et de trame se croisent. Et il est très curieux.
When the image is blown up very large, it is interesting to see how the coloration only appears at specific cross points in the fabric.
À des endroits bien précis qui
So this cloth image is analogous to a printing press image.
tramées, tout à fait analogue.
Using today's terminology, we might even say that the image on the Shroud of Turin is a true digital image plotted in pixels.
Numérique formée en fait de pixels.
That being said, it should be noted that traces of paint were found on the shroud. This is often pointed out by skeptics to discredit the shroud. In reality, the presence of particles of iron oxide used as a paint dye can be easily explained. In the Middle Ages, there was a popular belief that if you took a vile object and placed it in contact with a sacred object, the vile object would become as pure as the sacred object itself. Once this transfer was complete, the new sacred object was given as much respect as the original religious relic. When we understand how popular the transfer of religious relics was in the Middle Ages, it becomes reasonable to believe that one or more of these fake shrouds would have been placed in contact with the genuine shroud. In that case, it wouldn't be surprising to find paint particles on the shroud.
I think that the best evidence today is due to the fact that it was not possible until now to build an image in some way identical to the shroud ones. This is the more big mystery, if you want to call in this way, in the sense that a lot of scientists tried in this last 1 century, both from the theoretical and from experimental point of view, to reproduce, starting from a corpse, an image identical to the shroud one. But until now, the results are not very good.
Even if the Shroud of Turin was used to wrap the body of a tortured man, there is still room for doubt as to whether or not the body reproduced on the fabric is that of Jesus of Nazareth, who died on the cross 2,000 years ago. When STURP's findings were released in 1978, many people were ready to swear to the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. But unfortunately, the requirements of science are different from those of belief. What's more, the Shroud of Turin falls within the religious realm, and scientists are not too crazy about dealing with the divine. Something more would be needed to convince them. Additional proof. Proof such as carbon dating. The technique is based on a simple principle. When a living organism dies, it gradually releases the carbon that it accumulated while it was alive. This is a slow and stable process. Therefore, it is possible to determine the age of an object by calculating the amount of carbon-14 still present.
Carbon testing was done in 1988, 1989. That was when the trouble began. The results created a bombshell effect. The shroud was dated between 1250 and 1360 by 3 laboratories: Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson, USA. Obviously, there were immediate claims that the shroud was a fake. First of all, and scientists who do carbon testing will confirm this, a carbon-14 analysis is only reliable to the degree that it is placed in context and agrees with archaeological elements. Ironically, only the non-archaeological element is the one that disagrees with the rest.
This dating process has been very controversial. There may have been errors in interpreting the results. It must be pointed out that the carbon-14 method is not an infallible method. It dates carbon-14 levels present in a sample, but this sample needs to be isolated and must not have been contaminated with more recent carbon-14. Everyone knows that the shroud was moved around a lot over the centuries, that it almost burned in a fire in Chambéry in 1532, that it was sprayed with water, and that it was handled a lot each time that it was displayed. So it is clear that it has not been isolated from outside influences. We can therefore imagine that contaminations by more recent carbon-14 could have affected the dating results.
If you've got a piece of linen, for example, or any plant material, it's quite easy to add other contaminants onto the outside of it, which, if taken as a whole, would change the radiocarbon date. What's very difficult is to actually change the carbon that's embedded within the cellulose itself. So as long as your pretreatment, your chemical pretreatment as part of the dating actually gets back to the cellulose, it's very difficult to change the date. In the case of the shroud, if you're thinking about a cloth that's, say, 2,000 years old and has medieval contamination on it, you would have to have more contamination present than the original cloth in order to shift the date by 1,000 years, because ultimately the date you get will be something like an average of the different species. So that's why I don't think contamination can be seen as an explanation for such a large discrepancy.
So, okay, I'm going to make a statement as a statistician because statistics are my specialty. So, like many other statisticians, I like to spend my time looking at columns of numbers. In this case, the numbers were measurements taken during the carbon testing. And statistically speaking, I noticed that the results in these columns of numbers did not agree with each other. I have no idea why they don't agree. Maybe someone made a clerical error during the biochemical dating process. I don't know what the error was. That's outside of my area of competency. Anyways, the one thing I can say is that when columns of figures do not match, then the dating cannot be considered as valid.
We can say, first of all, that the problem of dating a cloth is a very complicated problem. We have to take into account that the cloth is very sensible to pollution, both from the biological and from the chemical point of view. And experiments made in different parts of the world, not on the shroud, but on other ancient linen, proves that sometimes the C14 can give also several centuries, a date several centuries younger, due to contamination of microorganisms, for example, present on the cloth, or due, for example, to the presence, to the living of the cloth in an atmosphere very rich of carbon dioxide, of carbon oxide.
The Shroud of Turin. Well, for any of these types of religious relics that might have been in actual contact with Jesus Christ, there are serious ramifications for Christians, for religious followers. Because if something is authentic, it's further historic proof that Jesus existed.
The Church is not afraid of science and allowed the carbon-14 dating. In fact, it was not allowed until the Church got ownership. Now, it was quite a surprise when the results were published about the carbon-14 dating test, and the Church lived with that. And millions of people continued to visit the shroud. Pope John Paul II visited Turin in the Holy Year. I think he was the one who asked for the veneration of the shroud in 1998 in preparation for the Jubilee. So it was an extra special showing of the shroud, which normally occurs only on the Holy Years every 25 years. And the millennium, the second millennium, was a very major Jubilee year in that regard.
There have been a lot of scientific studies questioning scientific knowledge since the image was truly discovered. In other words, since the shroud was photographed for the first time in 1898. And what's interesting to see is that when investigations have been carried out on the Shroud over the past century or so, investigations into past research on the Shroud, militant atheists will support the Shroud's authenticity, and professors of medicine at large universities will say there is no doubt that this Shroud was used to wrap the body of a man crucified 2,000 years ago. And on the other hand, we see certain priests and theologists, I know one in particular, who will staunchly defend claims that it is a fake. You'd think the opposite would be true.
How are we to interpret all of the contradictions surrounding this piece of cloth? Could carbon dating have led 3 independent, reputable laboratories to erroneous results? Could an unknown con artist from the Middle Ages have been able to figure out the notions of photographic negatives, pixels, and radiation? Who was this man? Crucified exactly as Jesus was according to the Gospels, and who left his imprint on this shroud from Judea. If the Shroud of Turin is a fraud from the Middle Ages, as carbon dating seems to prove, then it must be acknowledged that whoever created it was a truly gifted visionary, an engineer. And if the Shroud is authentic, how can we help but be moved by the image of this tortured man who looks out over 2,000 years of history?
This is thoroughly possible through the Shroud, without declaring on the question of its age and its origin. Then through this you can enter into a contemplation of the character of this man. It's an extraordinary person. His face, it's powerful, it's captivating, it brings you into a spirit of great reverence, a deep pondering, I would say the beginning of love, a realization that suffering is not the last word, that sin is horrible, that violence in the human heart knows almost no bounds. If this truly is the document of the burial of Christ and his resurrection, then it brings us right there to where the Son of God was killed by human hands. But then it also brings us to the peace that he had and to his triumph.
Whether it is an authentic relic or a Middle Ages hoax, the Shroud of Turin's very existence is a miracle. So is the resurrection of Christ and human ingenuity. I'm not sure which of the two impresses me the most.